If you're ever out at a party with friends or even just shuffling through Spotify, you're likely to come across a song created by this man from the UK. I mean, look at these crowds he's pulling in for shows. He's exploding right now. But like many artists, you can pinpoint their rise. But Fred is different. His arrival into the music industry is completely unique. There's something about his rise that has been confusing the world, because even the most tapped in people in the industry were blindsided by his sudden appearance. I remember I was sitting on Instagram one day and I came across a video of Justin Bieber playing this song. It's rare when one of the most famous people in the world is playing a song you've never heard. There I was. Even though I loved his music, my first reaction was to assume that this was some kind of industry plant, and I'm sure so many other people thought that. It's because there's a major reason we don't know where he came from. Some call it an industry plant, but this is something uniquely different. And honestly, calling him an industry plant is lazy, because I see it entirely unique. It involves a man getting everything he worked for, but finding out it wasn't enough, and what he truly wanted was going to force him to risk losing everything he's worked for 20 years. And he had to completely redefine what success meant to himself. Fred's story starts in London, where he grew up among England's highest royalty and went to a prestigious boarding school where he studied and learned classical music. Fred was a bona fide English rich kid, like almost straight out of a book. He grew up in Balham, South London, where he was raised by his family of prestigious earls, dukes, and aristocrats. And his parents enrolled him in one of London's most expensive boarding schools, a yearly cost with around £42,000 or $50K in US dollars. And with his full name being Frederick John Philip Gibson, he seemed to be set in line for a nice life as British royalty. But this is where Fred started to separate himself from his peers. Not academically, but with his interests in a specific style of music. While others were more focused on traditional forms of classical music, as you'd expect from a really expensive boarding school, Fred was more interested in things like hip-hop and rap.
I was like the rebel guy, because I would like bring in my friends who are like rappers and stuff, and I'd play like a piece for like, you know, tuba and someone rapping. They'd be like, this guy's ridiculous. What's he doing? I quite enjoyed being like provocative.
It was his way of rebelling against the standards set by the people around him. And he says he'd sneak off to go create music because he was, quote, fortunate enough to not be slightly good at anything else. So he put all his focus into music. He was a kid who loved hip hop and rap, but was in a world surrounded by classical music. Fred had a super unique passion for music, and it wasn't going to die anytime soon. In his off time from school, Fred would surround himself with music, so he'd volunteer to help out at a musical a cappella group ran by his friend's neighbor, who's a musical producer.
I would go there every week from when I was 16 and just hang with just like, it's hilarious.
He'd tidy up the music sheets and bring you on tea if they needed. But when class was over, he'd absorb any kind of information he could tape from the instructor. Fred, just being 16 at the time, admitted he wasn't completely aware of how big of a producer his neighbor's friend actually was until later. It was Brian Eno. Yeah. That Brian Eno. If you know anything about Brian Eno, you know he's one of the most influential producers to ever live, and the actual inventor of ambient music, living right next door to Fred's friend. Fred was definitely lucky to have this circumstance, and he's well aware of it. And to his own credit, he took complete advantage of it. Even though Fred was the stereotypical rich English kid, his work ethic wasn't stereotypical. He'd hustle every day for Brian after his a cappella class, spending nearly every day after school in his studio just mastering his craft.
If he told me to make a song out of this, I'd make like 30 different things to play on by the next day and like not sleep. So I was definitely behind the scenes. I was like making sure this did not go to waste.
And Brian Eno didn't see Fred as just a typical kid who loved music. Brian saw something special.
I think of Fred as my mentor as well. You know, when I first worked with Fred, I could see he was brilliant. It's very clear he's a very, very sensitive and good artist.
If Fred again is Luke Skywalker, this is his trip to Dagobah to meet Master Yoda. He's trying to master his craft and accidentally come across an unassuming master in his field who's willing to pass on everything he has to train a young, promising pupil. Except luckily, Brian doesn't die at the end of this.
I'm not looking for a friend. I'm looking for a Jedi Master.
Fred absorbed everything he could from Brian, often helping each other on projects. Brian, who described himself as a non-musician, had a quirky studio with a very unique style of creating music. Fred took this in and applied it to his own style of music, not letting any conformity in, just creativity. And if you listen to anything Fred makes now, you completely see the influence. While in college, Fred quickly realized that the instructors valued completely different things in him. Recalling a time where Fred worked on one of his proudest pieces, turned it in, and received mostly a negative grade, only for the next project to be rushed and turned in last second second to receive positive grades. So ultimately, Fred realized the best decision would be to drop out. Fred began his own career as a producer, going by simply the name Fred Gibson, or Fred. His first ever production credits for any officially released songs were for Brian Eno's album Someday World and High Life. Probably the best way to start your career for any producer ever. Collaborating with one of the best producers to ever live on 21 songs when you were just 20 years old. But Fred claims Brian, much like Yoda, is an outsider of the industry.
Like, he just does his own thing. He goes to the studio, he paints most of the time. He works on the things that cross his mind. He'll spend a whole year trying to evolve some new sort of science thing almost as much as he will a music thing.
So Fred had the experience and the abilities to create. Now he just needs to get the attention of these artists. Fred, with the help of his brother, who's also his manager, was cold emailing A&Rs his symphonies he made while he was at school. And it didn't take long for Fred to find his way back into his true love, hip-hop producing.
And I did an album with a guy called Roots Maneuver not long after I worked with Brian. He's like the UK godfather of hip-hop.
And his solo career was finally taking off. That same year, he'd produced 2 songs for Ellie Goulding, one of UK's biggest pop stars. 2 years into his producing career, Fred is already having insane success. For the following 2 years, he produced for artists such as Charlie XCX, Stefflon Don, and Jax Jones, all massive UK artists. But it wouldn't be until 2018 when things started to truly explode.
Earthrise on the moon.
That's so beautiful.
He was able to produce music for Rita Ora, Demi Lovato, Shawn Mendes, and Burna Boy, some of the biggest pop artists in not just the UK, but the world. And he hit the pinnacle of his career at the time, producing Shotgun by George Ezra, which reached #1 in the UK. To produce a #1 song for an artist is what every producer dreams of, but Fred was still elevating his craft. To produce a single song is one thing, but to be a producer for an entire project is another. The following year, he'd do just that, taking part in producing 11 of the 15 songs on Ed Sheeran's massive #6 collaboration project. A #1 album in 14 countries that sold over 170k units first week. There's really no argument now. In a quick 5 years, Fred has reached the top of the pop producing world, with his name attached all over the Billboard Top 100. He's already grown so much from the 16-year-old kid that would chase Brian Eno around his studio. Even though everything is going perfect, everything is about to be different for not only Fred, but the entire world.
Good evening. The coronavirus is the biggest threat this country has faced for decades, and this country is not alone.
It's 2020, COVID has hit the entire world, and the UK is shut down. Fred's career is at its peak, and he's forced to stop everything. But was it really at its creative peak? I mean, Fred is a self-described hip-hop kid, and through his own success, he found himself pigeonholed in a pop world.
I thought of myself as like mainly a hip-hop producer from when I was like younger.
Even though he did everything right and achieved every goal he could have wanted in 5 years, something was missing.
After a few years, there was a feeling that there was something like I needed to make that I wasn't making.
Fred was at a crossroad in his career. Does he halt his progress and venture out onto his own stuff? Or does he continue the success he's had as a pop producer? Sitting at home during COVID, he was having a tough decision until he received a phone call from a familiar friend that changed his life forever.
Brian messaged me at the same time. He was like, I'm cleaning my kitchen and I've left all of my iTunes on loop. Every time it goes to a song that I like, I run into the room and I see it's an old sketch of yours, and it was very sweet of him to say that. So he was like, you've got to go back to doing this now. Wow. It was like, you know, I was already at the cliff, and then it was just like...
So that year of lockdown, Fred would risk everything by possibly losing his momentum as a pop producer and pivot away to set out and finalize his first solo studio album, Actual Life. A fitting title for this project. This project was centered around the authenticity of life. The titles all being first names of the people he sampled through voice memos or videos, the title of the album dating the time he spent creating the project, and the cover art being a simple phone selfie.
The whole kind of framing of every song, like how it's named and the structure of it all, is just what happened as I was making the music, because it's what you would instinctively do, because it was like, okay, I'm sampling this person called Clara, I named the song Clara, and the date is this, and I finished the record on this date. So I was keen to show the diary aspect of it, I guess.
It's a stripped back, authentic view of an artist creating art and wanting to create feelings. Fred would focus in on small moments that we'd have on our phones with our friends that he felt like deserved more attention.
The feeling that I became really obsessed with was like trying to take the like very fleeting moments and like trying to like expose as much beauty as is in them.
Fred had the pop world in his hands and gave it up to pursue something on the other end of the spectrum. Music, specifically EDM music, was at such an over-polished level pre-lockdown. Fred broke down the barrier between consumer and artist and let someone into his world, making the listener almost feel like they're listening to his music straight off the Logic software with raw file names.
Humans are being atomized, increasingly atomized, separated off. I'm so pleased to see the opposite also happening, that there's a kind of a new movement that says, no, let's just reuse things. let's find things and make sense of them again, use them differently.
And a lot of his ideas and recordings would not happen in studios with perfectly soundproof walls and expensive equipment, but in noisy places like a cinema or even a club. Nothing Fred was creating currently was remotely similar to what he used to do. But he didn't care. This wasn't to satisfy a chart or help an artist reach 100K units. This was all about doing something he loved.
Started off, for me, I've been enormously changed by all the messages I've read and seeing people at shows and the way people have kind of let the music in. It's totally changed me, and I'm immeasurably grateful for it.
COVID marked a time where consumers were fed up with anything ostentatious and were seeking anything with an authentic view. And Fred's music provided that. And with Fred finally releasing his solo music, the people who were looking for it were only industry people, because that's the only people who were aware of Fred's talent at the time. Fred had people like Brian Eno, Ed Sheeran, Stormzy, and Ellie Goulding sharing his music before local music bloggers did. While this may come off as an industry plant from the outside looking in, it's a deeper case of an artist working hard behind the scenes and then making something unique and interesting that is different than anyone else. So when I watch that video of Justin Bieber playing the Fred Again song, I don't see an industry plant like I used to. Instead, I see the culmination of a ton of hard work behind the scenes. On March 26th of 2020, the day England was locked down due to COVID, Fred was at 513,654 monthly listeners on Spotify. 2 years later, he sat at nearly 4 million. Now, in 2024, he's at 18 million. A meteoric rise for a solo artist who was once pop producer Fred Gibson just 4 years ago. Fred would release Actual Life 2 and Actual Life 3, extensions of his first work, and would build upon this idea. And he's now collaborating with artists such as Lil Yachty, Baby Keem, and Anderson .Paak, as well as remixing songs with Future and Rico Nasty. The once pop producer is finally back to where he started, creating hip-hop beats with classical structure. And to finally find what he was looking for all along, he had to go back to where he started and figure out why he got into it in the first place. Fred Again is now headlining Coachella and selling out stadiums, all because he started taking a risk on himself and started to focus on what fulfills himself. Fred's story is really just the beginning, and if he stays on this track, he could be bigger than his mentor ever was. As his mentor, Brian Eno said it perfectly.
You don't generally sit comfortably in the middle of what you know you can do and just do it all over again. The thrill is to go to an edge and look over into a land you've never seen before, and then go there.